Today we're talking about square roots. To start off, we need to understand a little bit about what square roots are. So square roots come from the idea of a square. So let's look at this basic square. The area of this square is what? If you think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, you are indeed correct. The area of a square is the same as what's called the perfect square. The length of one side, what do you think the length of one side of the square is? It's 1, 2, right? So the length of each side of our square is 2. We know that squares have all sides congruent. So the length of one side is 2. And the length of one side is also referred to as the square root, or the root of the square. So what is the area of a square whose sides are whole numbers? That's called a perfect square. So for example, if I have 2 times 2, that equals 4. 4 is a perfect square. What is the length of one side of a square? It is the what root? The square root. When you find the square root of a number, ask yourself what number times itself equals this number. Do not divide by 2. So, for example, if I'm finding the square root of 36, I don't say what's 36 divided by 2. Instead, I ask myself what number times itself equals 36. 6. 6 times 6 equals 36. So you're thinking of a square that has a length of 6 on each side, and to find the area you multiply 2 sides, which gives you 36. So that's where square root and perfect square come from. So if we look at this algebraically, b times b equals b squared. For example, 6 times 6 equals 6 squared, or 6 times 6 equals 36. B squared, therefore, is the perfect square. And b is the square root. Again, if you're thinking in terms of a square, with that algebraic rule, b would be the length of one side, b squared would be the area. So what is 6? Is that going to be the square root or the perfect square? 6 is the square root. What about 36? 36 is the perfect square. Now if we have something like 51.84 as the area of a square, that is not a perfect square because the lengths of the sides are not whole numbers. Now, it doesn't mean that 7.2 squared doesn't equal something. It does. 7.2 squared equals 51.84. However, 51.84 is not considered a perfect square. So if we look at 2 as the area of a square, and we're trying to ask ourselves what number times itself equals 2, well, there's not a whole number times itself that equals 2. So we know that 2 cannot be a perfect square. When a number is not a perfect square, the most exact way to refer to that number is with a square root symbol. So we're just going to say that each side has a length square root of 2. And that's a lot more exact than finding what the square root of 2 is to figure out the length of each side. We could put the square root of 2 in our calculator. So if I take the square root of 2 on my calculator, so there's my square root of 2. Notice it's 1.4, 142, 135, 6, etc., etc., etc. This is an infinite decimal. It goes on forever, and it does not repeat or have a pattern. Therefore, this is actually what kind of number? This is an irrational number. So, oftentimes, if the area of your square, or the area inside, if you're trying to take the square root of something that is not a perfect square, you'll get an irrational number. And since irrational numbers are infinite, it's more exact to just write the number as the square root of whatever the area of your square is. That way, you're not rounding. So I could have said 1.4, but that's not exactly right because I had to round. If I say the square root of 2 is equal to the square root of 2, then that is exact. So here we have a cube. So if we find how much goes inside the cube, what is that called? How would you find how much will fit inside of here? That's the volume, right? And we have 3 dimensions. So we'd multiply 3 times 3 times 3 to get 27. Well, that is also known as the perfect cube. Just like we have a perfect square. Again, this is for when we have a number that a number multiplied 3 times can equal. So a whole number multiplied 3 times can equal 27. Therefore, 27 is a perfect cube. So what do you think the length of one side is called? You think it's a cube root? You are correct. So the notation is the cubed root of 27 equals 3. This is what square root looks like. The square root of 16 equals 4. So with cubed root, what we're saying here is that if we take 3 and multiply it 3 times, we'll get 27. Therefore, the cubed root, or third root of 27 is 3. And in the next problem, we're saying that if we take 4 and multiply it twice, we'll get 16. So the second root, or square root of 16, is 4. Square root is so common, we don't put the 2 where we normally list what root we're working with. Only if you're dealing with a third root, fourth root, etc., do we write that in. So let's look at some examples. So the square root of 1 is asking what number times 2 equals 1. 1 times 1 equals 1. So the square root of 1 is 1. So the square root of 16 is saying what times what equals 16. What number times itself? Well, 4 times 4 equals 16. So the square root of 16 equals 4. So what's the square root of 64? 8. So what do you think the square root of 0 is? This is 0, because 0 times 0 equals 0. What about the opposite of the square root of 100? So that's what this means in number 5. The opposite of the square root of 100. Well, the square root of 100 is 10, right? 10 times 10 is 100. The opposite of 10 is just negative 10. Number 6, the cubed root of 8. So what number times itself 3 times is going to equal 8? If you said 2, you are correct. The opposite of the cubed root of 1. So what number times itself 3 times equals 1? 1, right? And they want the opposite of it, so it's negative 1. What number times itself 3 times equals 64? If you don't know this one, it's 4. 4 times 4 times 4 is 64.